July 23, 1944. A firing squad assembles in a German prison yard. Their target isn't a spy or an enemy, it's their own general. But why would soldiers execute the man who once saved his division? Well, stay with me, because the reason he died, and what he did before that, makes this a story best told before it's judged. To understand how a senior officer ends up against a wall in the middle of a world war, we rewind several decades. Hans Graf von Sponeck joined the German army in the early 1900s. He was born on February 12, 1888, in Düsseldorf, Germany. He was a career officer, precise, methodical, a staff man who learned to move units on paper before anyone moved on the ground. During the First World War, he served as a staff officer on the Western Front. He was wounded more than once, decorated for service, and climbed to captain by the end of the war. After the armistice, he stayed in uniform through the lean interwar years, part of a much smaller army limited by the Treaty of Versailles, but still training, studying, and promoting slowly. In the late 1930s, and after commanding Infantry Regiment 48, he was briefly transferred to the Luftwaffe to help set up airborne and air landing units. During the Fritsch affair, he appeared as a witness and crossed paths with Hermann Göring, who was head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most powerful lieutenants, and who presided over parts of the proceedings, a friction that would echo later. By the late 1930s, Germany was rearming, and Sponeck's experience was used to shape troops trained for air landing operations, an infantry that could be flown to capture airfields and bridges and then hold them. Unlike paratroopers, air landing troops were meant to arrive by transport aircraft onto seized airstrips and hold them as conventional infantry. He was not a public figure, but within the army he had a reputation for control under pressure. In May 1940, the Battle of the Netherlands began as part of Germany's Western Offensive, Case Yellow. Paratroopers and air-landed infantry moved to seize airfields around The Hague. The fighting was confused and costly. Transport aircraft wrecked on runways, counterattacks driving into thin perimeters. Sponeck was wounded and nearly captured amid the chaos, but his command held long enough for broader operations to stabilize. For his role, he received the Knight's Cross, an award that marked decisiveness in crisis. That success built part of the image that followed him, an officer who could keep formation when plans frayed. A year later, the war shifted east. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Sponeck's 22nd Infantry Division moved south into Ukraine and toward Crimea with Army Group South. On maps, the division's task was straightforward: secure coastal approaches, railheads, and crossings. In practice, the occupation also brought police and security directives. Surviving documents from the period show cooperation between field units and the security police and the SD in the rear. 2 days before the invasion, on June 20, 1941, Sponeck's staff ordered that Jewish Red Army prisoners of war be separated from other prisoners. On October 7, 1941, he directed his division to cooperate with the security police, known as SEPO, in rounding up and handing over Jewish civilians in captured towns such as Henichesk and Melitopol, and subsequent mass shootings are documented in those places. In Melitopol, about 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered. Killings are also recorded in Feodosia around December 10, 1941. Anti-partisan guidelines circulated that treated broad categories of people as threats, including orders that conflated Jews with partisans, required identifying marks and forced labor, and hardened rules for how suspected enemies were handled. Other directives allowed summary shootings of captured Red Army soldiers under security provisions. Those papers sit in archives today. They form part of the record of how the war in the East was fought behind the lines as well as at the front. That background matters because it explains the environment in which the next decision was made. Late December 1941 brought a sudden crisis in Crimea. In the autumn, he had briefly commanded the 42nd Army Corps during operations toward Crimea, before resuming divisional responsibilities as the Kerch situation developed. the Red Army landed on the Kerch Peninsula in force. Weather closed in, supply lines were strained, and German units on the eastern side of the peninsula risked being surrounded. High command orders were clear: no retreat, hold positions. Those orders had been emphasized repeatedly from the top. But officers on the ground were watching the situation change by the hour. Sponeck assessed the risk of encirclement and chose to withdraw his division to a more defensible line to avoid destruction. The movement was organized and hard. It pulled men out before the door shut behind them. The division survived as a fighting formation. For many who marched in that column, the withdrawal meant life. This is where the earlier reputation for control under pressure connects to events, a decision made to preserve a unit versus an order to stand fast. The Army's legal code, however, did not weigh survival of a unit against disobedience lightly. In January 1942, Sponeck was brought before a special court on the charge of disobedience in the face of the enemy. On January 23, 1942, a special court chaired by Hermann Göring sentenced him to death. The sentence was later commuted to fortress imprisonment, which was a privileged custody category in German law that did not involve penal labor and historically carried less stigma than ordinary prison terms. Commutation did not erase the conviction. It meant confinement instead of immediate execution. Sponeck was sent to the military prison at Germersheim. There he remained through 1942 and 1943, out of the war, but very much still in the system that had judged him. For more than 2 years, nothing changed. Then, far from Germersheim, an explosion in a conference hut in East Prussia set off a chain of decisions. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb during a briefing at Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. The attempt to kill Hitler failed. The response from the state was immediate and broad. Arrests, interrogations, and executions across the military and civilian networks suspected of involvement. Within that wave of reprisals, existing cases and old sentences were reviewed with a new and harsher eye. Orders reached Germersheim concerning Sponeck. He had not taken part in the July 20th plot. Nonetheless, instructions were issued to carry out his execution. On July 23, 1944, 3 days after the bomb, Sponeck was taken into the yard at Germersheim. A firing squad of German soldiers formed. Commands were given. Shots were fired. The man who had once been decorated for keeping his head in crisis and later punished for moving his men to save them, was executed by his own army while still a prisoner. The enforcement followed pressure from Gauleiter Josef Bürkel and the approval of Heinrich Himmler. Initially buried quietly in Germersheim, Sponeck's remains were reinterred in 1952 at the Soldiers' Cemetery in Dahn in the Palatinate Forest. After the war, the memory of Sponeck's case shifted. For a time, he could be cited as an officer who had made a tactical decision to save his men and paid for disobedience with his life. Decades later, as more archival material was studied and published, the focus broadened to include the orders and cooperation behind the lines in 1941. Public honors were reconsidered. Some commemorations were removed or renamed as the record was re-examined. In 2015, following parliamentary debate and new scholarly work, the German Air Force renamed the General Hans Graf Sponeck Kaserne in Germersheim to Südpfalz-Kaserne, with the rechristening on June 22, 2015. And by the way, the name did not end with the firing squad. His son, Hans Christoph von Sponeck, born in 1939, later served as a United Nations Assistant Secretary General, a reminder that this story continued in another arena after 1945. That is the story of Hans Graf von Sponeck, told in sequence with the records we have. If you found this useful and want more straightforward narratives like this, events first, documents where they matter, consider subscribing. And if you have a view on how history should remember figures like Sponeck, given both battlefield decisions and the policies enforced behind the lines, I would like to read it in the comments.